Welcome. My name is Jennifer Macias. I'm the History Programs Coordinator with Colorado Humanities. Thank you. And on behalf of Colorado Humanities and some of our wonderful staff members here, we're so incredibly thankful that you are able to come tonight and enjoy what is going to be a very special program. This is the only evening where we have both of our speakers at the same time, and so we'll get to enjoy a really important piece of history this evening. Each year, to celebrate Black History Month, Colorado Humanities presents first-person dramatizations of African Americans who made significant contributions to American history. We are going to do something special tonight where we will have our first presenter, Rosa Parks, share with us about her experiences, and then I will invite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. up to the stage to present. After both of their presentations, they will remain in character, and they'll give us the opportunity to ask them questions. So I offer that as an example of, as you're sitting and listening, anything that you would like to ask them about their experiences, their families, any tidbits that you're interested in. Keep your questions until we do the Q&A portion. And then at the end, we'll welcome our wonderful scholars who are here with us and the opportunity to be able to ask them questions about doing Chautauqua-style presentations. But thank you again for coming. We're really grateful for you all for being here. Starting then, let's go back in time. The year is 1967. It's been 10 years since the end of the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa is currently working in the Detroit office of Representative John Conyers. Since the boycott, she has continued to fight for civil rights by participating in demonstrations, lending her name to favorite causes, and going on speaking engagements such as this one. Please help me welcome Rosa Parks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Macias. And thank you for being here. I really appreciate your taking the time to hear my story. And I'm also just overjoyed to see all these young people. Young people are very close to my heart, even though Parks and I never had any children. I relish every opportunity to set the record straight. You see, it's just been 10 years since the bus boycott, which is my one claim to fame. And in that time, I've been called the mother of the modern civil rights movement. And I feel uncomfortable with that title. I haven't really earned it. I hope by the time I finish my story this evening, you will understand that there were many, many other people involved, and my role was just a small one. And the image of me in these 10 short years has come up of Rosa Parks, that quiet little old woman with the aching feet who couldn't give up her seat one more time on the bus. Well, first of all, I wasn't old. I'm a good 10 years older now, but then I was 42, and that's the midst of life. And then I'm not sure how my feet got into it, but that conjures up images of my being a domestic and cleaning and cooking and taking care of white people's children, when that was not the case at all. I was and had been for quite a while a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store. You see, If you were colored and shopping in Montgomery Fair, you were not allowed to try on anything. No hats, gloves, shoes, jewelry, let alone any of the clothes. But if you were white, then you could try on the clothes. And if they did not fit you very well, the tailor could be called, and he would make marks and indicate where some sewing needed to be done. And the clothes were taken down to us in the basement, and we would make those adjustments so that in a few days you could come back and collect up your clothing, the perfectly tailored outfit. So no, I was not on my feet all day, but I was tired. The only tired I was of giving in. And we all had been giving in all our lives to Jim Crow. When I say Jim Crow, most people think of a set of laws that were meant to separate the races, but they were much more than that. They were mean-spirited laws that were meant to degrade us and to strip us of our humanity. And they were different from state to state, city to city. So you never really knew what you were safe doing. And they were not just laws, they were customs that were enforced as if they were laws. Customs such as never introducing yourself to a white person and including your last name. And if your name was Sally and they decided that they were going to call you Mary, you dare not correct them. You certainly couldn't shake hands with any white person. And if any white person extended their hand to shake yours or showed you any kind of consideration or courtesy, they were in trouble too. They could be risking their jobs, their home, their family. It was a prison for all of us. If you were colored, you could not even walk down the sidewalk with white people. You had to step off the sidewalk and let them go by, and then you could resume your way on the sidewalk when they were gone. No, you died a little bit every time you faced that kind of discrimination. I need to tell you how the buses worked in Montgomery, Alabama at that time. There were 36 seats on the bus. The first 10 seats were for white passengers only. The back 10 seats were for colored only, and it said so over the window at the back of the bus. Colored only. The 16 seats in between were called the mixed seats, and we could sit there if no white person needed those seats. If a white person needed a seat or chose to sit down across the aisle from you, you had to give up your seat. It was against the law to sit on the same row as a white person. The fare was 10 cents. If you were white, you got on at the front of the bus, put your 10 cents in the machine, and took a nearby seat. If you were colored, you got on at the front of the bus and paid your 10 cents, and then you got off the bus and went to the back doors to get into the bus. Sometimes the bus driver would go off before you could get on at the back. And there goes your ride and your 10 cents. Sometimes it was so crowded at the back that people were standing in the stepwell and it was hard to get on. You would have to help people on so that the doors could close, and sometimes the doors closed on Negro passengers. And the driver would go off and would only stop when everyone was yelling, "Stop, there's someone stuck in the door." Some drivers were considerate, others were not. They all carried a pistol to remind everyone that they enforced the law on their buses. Now, 1955 was not the first time that I had an incident on the bus. In 1943, I got on the bus and paid my 10 cents, and then I looked and I could see that the back was crowded. I probably would not be able to get on at the back of the bus. So I very quickly made my way down towards the back of the bus when I heard the bus driver call out, "Where do you think you're going?" And I explained the situation, and he said, "Not on my bus, you're not." And he popped up from the seat, came down the aisle, reaching for me, and I said, "Do not strike me. I can leave the bus on my own." And so I made my way past him to the front of the bus, and I accidentally dropped my purse. And I sat down on a white seat to pick up my purse. And when I looked back at him, I made a point of memorizing his face, as red as it was because he was so angry. But I promised myself then I would never get on his bus again. And I kept that promise for 12 years. I remember it being 1943 when that happened, because that was the year that I became a member of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I had read in the paper that Johnny Carr was active in that branch, and Johnny was a classmate of mine whom I hadn't seen in years. So I told Parks, my husband, his name is Raymond Parks, but ever since I met him, I've always called him Parks. So I told Parks I was going to go to that meeting, and when I got there, Johnny wasn't there. But they were organizing for the year and electing officers. I was the only woman there. So I was elected secretary of the branch. And being secretary meant more than just taking minutes. It meant writing Congress every year, asking for the passage of anti-lynching legislation. It never happened. It still has not happened. Whenever anyone came to report a case of violence or police brutality, I, as secretary, was the one who took notes. We were always looking for a case that we could take on that would change life in Montgomery for us. And so I was often sent out to try and get an affidavit from those victims. And over 12 years, I did not get any. I couldn't blame them. They didn't want to stand up and and be identified as someone who would challenge the status quo. They could risk their lives, the lives of their family, their jobs, their homes. So I understood. And along with Johnny, I started the Youth Council of the NAACP branch in Montgomery. So I was active, but I was not a leader. Let me tell you what happened that day in 1955. It was December 1st, and I came out of the Montgomery Fair department store, and I could see at the bus stop there were far too many people for me to be able to get a seat. So I went across the street to Lee's Cut Rate, and I picked up a few things for our apartment. And as I was paying and getting my change, I saw that there was another bus, and I would be able to get a seat on it. So I quickly got my change, crossed the street, put my 10 cents in at the front, ran around to the back doors, and took a seat in the mixed seats, next to a lovely gentleman whose daughter was in my youth council. And I was planning a workshop for that Saturday morning, and I expected her to be there. So we talked back and forth, and then there was a white man standing. And the bus driver, looking in the mirror, called out, "Hey, I need them seats, y'all. Give me them seats." No one said anything. It got very quiet the way it always did times like that. And no one moved. "Make it light on yourselves," he said, "and give me them seats." Well, the women across the aisle got up and moved to the back. And the gentleman I was talking with stood, and I turned my feet into the aisle and let him get by and move on to the back. And then I slid over into his seat and looked out the window. I heard the bus driver get up and come back to my seat. And he asked, "You going to give me these seats?" And I turned, and it was the same bus driver that I had been avoiding for 12 years. "No," I said. "Well, I'm going to have you arrested." And I responded, "You may do that." And I turned back to look out the window. And he left, and 2 police officers came back to arrest me. "Why didn't you give up your seat when the bus driver told you to?" And I said, "Why do you always push us around?" And he said, "I don't know, lady, but the law's the law, and I'm going to have to arrest you." So they took me to the North Ripley Street jail, and they wouldn't let me get a drink of water from their water fountain. And I thought I had the right to make a phone call, but they wouldn't let me call home. They put me in a cell with a couple of other women, and then maybe an hour, the matron came back, and she said I could call home. And so she dialed the number and handed me the phone, and my mother answered. I said, "Mother, let me talk to Parks." And when I told Parks where I was, he said, "Rosa, are you all right?" And I said, "I'm fine. They haven't done anything to me, but I want to come home." "Well, I'll get there as soon as I can." And I knew that would take a while because we did not have a car. But the first people to arrive were E.D. Nixon, the president of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, and Clifford and Virginia Durr, good white friends who supported our cause. Clifford Durr was an attorney, and he was struggling because white clients wouldn't go to him because he was a friend of ours. So they paid my bail, and Parks arrived. We all went back to our apartment along with the 2 Negro attorneys that we had in Montgomery. And all I wanted to do was eat and go to bed. But they were planning. And before I went to bed, they asked if I would be the case that they could take to court and try to change the segregation on the buses. Of course I said yes. How could I say no? It is what we'd been fighting for, and especially the last 12 years as part of the NAACP. So I went to bed, and the next morning I got up and I went to work. And on Fridays, I always volunteered at Fred Gray's office. He was one of those 2 attorneys and was struggling, so I would do typing for him, filing, answer the phone. But when I got there that day, his office was filled with people, the phone ringing off the hook, because while I was asleep, Fred Gray had called Joanne Robinson, the president of the Women's Political Caucus and Council, But she was a professor at Alabama State Teachers College, and she had come from the North. And her very first week of work, she was thrown off the bus. She was humiliated and so angry. How could she know the Jim Crow laws, never having lived in the South before? But she was so angry that she even wrote a letter to the mayor saying, I'm going to boycott the buses because the way we are treated is shameful. It has to be unlawful, and we're going to take action about it. She got no support from the Negro community. So she waited a good 6 or 7 years before I had been arrested. And she asked Fred when he called, so is Mrs. Parks going to be the case? And he said, yes. So I can do this boycott finally? Yes. And so she went to her office and typed up a flyer that said, more or less, another Negro woman has been arrested on our buses. And her case goes to court on Monday, December 5th. We are asking everyone to not ride the buses as a show of solidarity with her. Please, if you must go to work or to school on Monday, walk or find a ride, but do not ride the buses. And we had to call it not riding the buses because there was a law in Alabama that outlawed any boycott. So she called or contacted all of her students, had them come that night, Thursday night, and distribute the 35,000 copies of that flyer that she had done on one of those old-fashioned mimeograph machines. And her students took the flyers to every house and every door of every apartment in our neighborhoods. We wanted everyone to know what was happening. They took stacks to all the colored schools and to all the churches, everywhere that we gathered. And E.D. Nixon during that time had met with the ministers, and he asked them to preach not riding the buses from the pulpit on Sunday. He also contacted a reporter he knew at the Montgomery Advertiser and gave him a flyer and asked him to put it in the paper. Well, the editor of the paper put it on the front page of the Sunday paper. So everyone knew, white and colored, what the plan was. They had organized the MIA over the weekend, Montgomery Improvement Association, and they were looking for a leader. And all of the members of the MIA, were professionals, funeral directors, the doctors, the two attorneys, lots of preachers, and they were vying with each other for the privilege of being the president of the MIA. When someone came late to the meeting, the new guy in town, a young guy, 26 years old, his first church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And when he stepped in the door, they pegged him for the presidency of the MIA. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr. And so they planned to have everyone meet at the bus stops so that if anyone could give them a ride, they would find passengers there, but they were not to get on the buses. They also planned to have a meeting that night at the Holt Street Baptist Church to let us know the next steps. Martin likes to tell the story of how he woke up on Monday morning. After his devotions, he went down to the kitchen where Coretta was preparing breakfast, and he said, "Coretta, I don't have the heart to go out and look out the window to see if anyone's riding the buses. Would you do that?" "Of course, Martin." She went into the living room and looked out the window, and it was moments before she said, "Martin, the 637 just went by and it was empty. No one rode the buses that day, white or colored, and we met as directed at the Holt Street Baptist Church. And there were thousands of people packed into the streets. You couldn't get anywhere close to the church, where there were loudspeakers outside so that people could pass on the information of what was happening inside. And inside, they thanked us for not riding the buses and making that a success. And then they asked, "Are you willing to continue not riding the buses until some demands we've drawn up are met?" Yes! The demands were Negro passengers would be treated with respect. They would hire Negro bus drivers to drive the routes through our neighborhoods. That the mixed seats would be first come, first served. If we had those seats, we would not have to give them up if a white person was standing. We did not ask for the end of segregation. We simply asked that the rules be changed a little bit. The mixed seats operated that way in Mobile, Alabama. All we wanted was to be a little more comfortable on the buses that we depended on day in and day out to live our lives. And the city said no. So we continued walking. People lost jobs. Christmas that year was very quiet and very traditional, simple. In January, we were still walking, and we were getting a bit discouraged when Reverend Bob Gretz, a white friend, he was the pastor of a Negro Lutheran church in my neighborhood, he contacted the New York Times and said, "I read that you're using all the news feeds you're getting from Montgomery, but you should send a reporter down here. There is a remarkable story in what's going on here. And so when the reporters came and published what was going on, the media just snapped it up. They dubbed us Montgomery, the walking city. And shoes started coming into the MIA office and from all over the country. We needed them. You know, and money came as well. We needed to help families that didn't have work or income anymore. We also needed money to improve our transportation system. We were running our own transportation system throughout the boycott. So we were encouraged a bit, but things changed dramatically on January 30th when they bombed Martin Luther King Jr.'s house. Coretta and their baby, they were home, but they were not hurt. And Martin was off speaking on behalf of our not riding the buses. But that night, the NAACP attorneys met and decided that my case was going nowhere. It had gotten bogged down in the Alabama state courts. They found 4 other women to make the case. It was Browder v. Gale was the name of the case that they took, not to the Alabama court system, but to the federal district court. And the federal court found in our favor, but it was challenged, appealed, and all the way up until finally in November, the Supreme Court of the United States found in our favor. And we had our last meeting December 20th at the Holt Street Baptist Church, where the MIA told us, tomorrow you can ride the buses. And there wasn't any cheering or rejoicing or dancing in the streets. People cried and said prayers. And I'll never forget the sight of seeing grown Black men sobbing until their bodies shook. It had been so long and so hard, not just the boycott, but all those years of living under Jim Crow. And now there was a small crack, a small bit of hope we had made for some change. The MIA told us we could ride the buses if we would not get on the bus and sit intentionally, on purpose, next to a white person and lord it over them. It was not a victory of Black over white. It was a victory for justice and democracy. And then they said we must conduct ourselves the way we have throughout the boycott. If they should hit you or spit on you or beat you or drag you off the bus, you are to do nothing. You are to say nothing. And if you cannot do that, don't ride the buses until you can. So the next day, all the media was in Montgomery to take pictures of the Reverends Abernathy and King riding on integrated buses. And someone said, what about that Mrs. Parks who started all of this? So one photographer came out to Cleveland Courts Apartments and asked me if I would pose for a picture. And I said no. I didn't want any more attention. But he said, Mrs. Parks, just one picture. We'll use the first bus that comes, please. So I put on my hat and coat and my gloves and got my purse, and we went down to the bus stop. And the first bus that came was empty. But the photographer said, Mrs. Parks, we need this shot. Why don't you get on and sit in that front seat? And he had his assistant sit on the seat behind me. And move over, Mrs. Parks, sit next to the window and look out the window the way you did that day. And so I did, and he took the picture, and then I went home. And don't you know that that was the picture they chose for the cover of Look magazine. And it's become the iconic picture for the end of the Montgomery bus boycott and the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. But this is something that only God could have arranged. The bus driver on the bus that day was the same one who had me arrested. So that's my story, and it's not the whole story, but I hope you understand that I was just a small part of what was just a magnificent and miraculous movement for change. And I do believe that at this point, Reverend King himself, and I'm so proud and happy to be with him here tonight, that he's going to share some stories with you. Thank you, and thank you for listening.
At this time, we would love to welcome up Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The time is Sunday morning, April 30th, 1967. The place is the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is about to enter his study to grant an interview prior to the sermon he is giving this morning regarding his controversial stand on the Vietnam War.
I don't normally give an interview prior to a sermon, but you are from Morehouse. Yes, Mr. Cook, how are you? Have a seat right there, Mr. Cook. Now, I wrote for the Maroon Tiger in 1947. I don't remember what I wrote exactly, but I do remember writing. I know it had something to do with injustice. In any case, did you bring your tape recorder? Good, because I may ask you to edit some things, not because I believe in censorship, but, well, I want to make sure that everything is clear and concise. And as you know, I have not been receiving a lot of good press lately. Now, one thing I'm not going to do is talk about the Vietnam War in this interview, because you're going to stay for the sermon and you'll get all of the information there. Also, I'm not going to talk about the focus that SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is making in regards to economic justice. I'll talk to you about that tomorrow. But I did write down the question that you have, so I could think about it. And the title of the article is The Political and Spiritual Journey of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And your first question is, how did I arrive here? Now, you being from Morehouse, I'm assuming you mean how did I arrive here in terms of my views on the Vietnam War and the focus on economic justice, because at face value, how I arrived here is I arrived here by car. But you being from Morehouse, I'm assuming you mean the former, not the latter. How did I arrive here? Well, Mr. Cook, I have to say that from the time I was born in 1929 to, I would say, December 1st, 1955, that my life was a great big Christmas present ready to be opened up. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, here. We lived on Auburn Avenue, where the Ebenezer Baptist Church is located, Sweet Auburn. And I grew up in a very loving household. That's why the concept of love is something that's not abstract to me. It was very loving. With my father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., my mother, Alberta Williams King, my grandmother Williams, whom we called Mama, call our mother Mother Dear, my older sister Christine, and my younger brother A.D., Alfred Daniel. And as I stated, it was a very loving household. My mother, very sweet-natured and very kind, and I don't remember there ever being any disagreement that I heard in the house. But my mother would always make sure to tell me that I was just as good as anyone else, and don't let anyone ever tell you different. But she was a very loving and sweet person, and I know part of my personality was influenced by her, as all of our personalities are influenced by our parents in some way. My father, he was a little bit different. He was very loving, but he could be very intimidating. He could speak to people in a very curt, forceful way that intimidated people. And it didn't matter whether the person was white or black. Let me give you an example. I remember I was very young, and I was riding in the back seat of the car. Of course, my father was driving, and I suppose he ran through a stop sign. And the white police officer came to the car and said, "Boy, don't you realize you ran through a stop sign?" And my father immediately pointed back at me and said, "That there is a boy. I'm Reverend King. And if you choose to speak to me in this manner, I will pretend you have nothing to say." Well, the white police officer hurriedly wrote the ticket and gave it to my father. Again, he had this way of talking to people. It didn't matter what color they were. That's just the way he was. Now, my father was also the disciplinarian of the family. And I must have received I received whippings until I was around 15 years old. And on one such occasion, my father was administering the corporal punishment, and this sort of spilled out onto the front porch. And I believe my father said something to the effect of, "Boy, I'm going to beat you till you become somebody, if it kills me," something of that nature. Now, my friend Howard, who lived next door, he was a little bit older than me, and he happened to see this. And he broke out laughing. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. And so my father stopped dealing with me and looked up at Howard. Said, oh, you thought that was funny. Now, Howard knew enough to say, "Oh, no. So he said, "Do you know what I'm trying to tell this boy? I'm trying to tell him I'm going to beat him till he becomes somebody. And if you keep laughing, I'm going to help you to become somebody." Now, this is a true story. My father called up Howard's mother, told her what happened, and asked her to send Howard over. I suppose to teach him how to become somebody. What happened to Howard? Well, Howard became the top-ranking Negro police officer in Atlanta, Georgia. I suppose my father taught him how to become somebody. In any case, my parents were very good at sheltering me from the harsher aspects of segregation, sheltering all of us. But if you're a Negro child growing up in the South, in the segregated South, you are going to encounter segregation in some way, and I am no different. It happened a few times, but there are two times that are very memorable. The first time, there was a white family who owned a store that was across the street from our home. Now, of course, they didn't live there, but when they came to the store, they would bring their young son. And he happened to be white, and we got along quite well. We were very dear friends. So one day I came to play with my friend, and he was standing there looking sort of strange. And I asked him, well, what's the matter? And he said, well, I can't play with you anymore. Why? Because you're colored. My parent told me I can't play with colored children. I was very disturbed by this. And I went home and told my parents, and they had that look that many black parents have when this subject comes up, and they sat me down and they told me about the history of slavery and segregation. And my mother was emphatic. She wanted me to know that I was just as good as anyone else and don't let anyone tell you different. But already this unconscious bitterness, hatred towards all white people started. And my parents also told me that we were Christians. And as Christians, we had to love our white brethren. Not love what they did, but certainly love them as people. And I couldn't understand that at the time. I couldn't understand how I could love someone who didn't love me. Now, I myself had a strange situation talking to my firstborn, or Yolanda. And me and Mrs. King had this situation. You see, Yolanda, you know, Funtown, the amusement park. And every time we went past a billboard, or every time it would come on, the ad would come on television, she would always want to go to Funtown. Oh, Mommy, Daddy, I want to go to Funtown. I want to go to Funtown so bad. And when this would come up, Mrs. King and I would either be silent or gently change the subject. Well, it came on television one day, and she was emphatic. Oh, I want to go to Funtown. Mommy, Daddy, why can't I go to Funtown? You know, Mr. Cook, there are those who say that I speak eloquently about various subjects, but I found myself stuttering and stammering, trying to explain to my baby why she couldn't go to Funtown. You see, sweetheart, darling, they will not allow you to go to Funtown because you are a Negro child. They don't allow any Negro children to go to Funtown, but I promise you that your father is going to do everything in his power to make sure that you and all Negro children get to Funtown. Now, you know, Mr. Cook, I've been in jail quite a few times. And on one occasion, I had spoken to my wife, and she had stated that my daughter Yolanda had asked, why do I go to jail so much? And I said, well, tell her that Daddy goes to jail to make sure that you and all the Negro children get to Funtown. And Yolanda said, well, you tell Daddy to stay in jail as long as he has to till I get to Funtown. That's a true story. You know, Mr. Cook, there was another event that took place. I was a little bit older. I was in high school, and I had entered into an oratorical contest. It was in Dublin, Georgia, which is quite a few miles away from Atlanta, Georgia. And I did very well. I think I came in second place, and we rode the buses. Now, I don't know if you know anything about the buses at this time, but I'm sure you do. And I'm so happy I was part of a movement that helped to rid ourselves of this shameful practice. But in any case, as you know, the buses were set up where, the white people would put their fare in the front, and they would sit in the front. There was a part that was called the mixed section, and then there was the part in the back where the Negroes would come in, put their money in, they would have to go around to the back and sit like that. And if more white people came on, then the Negroes would have to stand up, regardless of if there were any seats available. The whites would take those seats. That's what it was. And so this started happening while I was on the bus. And I suppose I didn't move fast enough, and the bus driver started calling me names and cursing at me. And then I got very defiant. I said, well, why do I need to get up? To myself, I said this. I'm just as good as anyone else. I just won an oratorical contest. But between the bus driver cursing at me and my teacher emphatically asking me to stand up, I stood up ultimately in the aisle. 90 miles. 90 miles, Mr. Cook. It was the angriest I'd ever been. Well, despite those instances, my folks did a wonderful job in sheltering me from the harsher aspects of segregation. I went to Morehouse in 1944 when I was 15 years old. Graduated from Morehouse in 1948, went to Crozier Seminary and got my divinity degree. Ultimately, I went to Boston University School of Theology, where I got my doctorate. And I married my wife, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, in 1953. I got my pastorate at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. And then, of course, I got my doctorate in 1955. And as I stated, it seemed as if my life was just like a great big Christmas present. But three things happened that ended all of that. One was in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional as it related to education, but we knew that segregation was unconstitutional, period. We knew that segregation was on a deathbed, and the only question was how expensive the white fathers wanted to make the funeral. Also, in 1955, the evil and macabre murder, lynching of Emmett Till galvanized black people all over the nation, and it let the world know what it was like to live in the South or in other places in this country. And on December the 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a brave woman by the name of Rosa Parks took a stand by sitting down. And in her doing that, it ignited a movement that started in Montgomery, but it went all over the country, and it influenced movements all over the world. It was called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And an organization had to be founded, which was called the Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA. And as it turned out, I was chosen to be the spokesperson or the leader of this organization. I didn't seek it, I didn't ask for it, but it was something that was, well, I had to do because of how it was given to me. And that, Mr. Cook, is what ended my Christmas present reality. Now, there is another question here that you have, which I think is very important. How had the movement impacted my faith? January 27th, 1956. Now, I know that date is obscure and doesn't mean a lot to many people, but it means a great deal to me. You see, when we started the Montgomery bus boycott, we thought it was only going to last a week or maybe even two. And what we wanted was basically a gentler form of segregation. But because the city fathers were so stubborn and so resistant in giving us anything, we decided we were going to rid ourselves of segregation on the buses altogether. And when the white folks saw that the black people meant business, they started doing some very, very nasty things. One of the things they did was to arrest members of the MIA, Montgomery Improvement Association. And I was arrested on January 26th, 1956. I was supposedly moving 30 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, something like that. In any case, they put me in the back seat of the cop car, police car, and I thought they were going to just take me to the Montgomery City Jail. And they drove me around for quite a while. And I have to admit, Mr. Cook, I got very nervous, and your mind starts playing tricks with you. Now, I was thinking, well, these are men of the law. Surely they won't let anything, quote, happen to me. But then something else in my mind said, well, they may not do anything, but they may put me in the hands of someone who will do something. I tell you, Mr. Cook, I was very, very nervous. And in the darkness, I saw a sign saying Montgomery City Jail. That was the happiest I'd ever seen a jail sign in all my life. Well, they put me in the segregated wing where the black prisoners were, and they started to recognize me. And they were saying, well, Reverend King, why are you here? And Reverend King, why would they arrest you? And this started turning into Reverend King, I was put here unjustly. And Reverend King, you have to help me to get out. And Reverend King, can you do this for me? And Reverend King, can you do that for me? And I had to raise my hand and say, fellas, before Reverend King can do anything for anybody, Reverend King first has to get out of jail. And they laughed. And as I was leaving, when my bail was posted, I heard one of them yell, "Don't forget about us, Reverend King." I never did. Well, that was the first time I had been arrested, Mr. Cook, and it was a galvanizing experience for me. Now, the next day, January 27th, 1956, I had been working at the Montgomery Improvement Association office all day. I just wanted to come home and go to bed. Now, as I stated, when the white folks saw that we meant business, they started doing very nasty, very ugly things. And another thing they would do is to call incessantly, saying all kinds of vile, evil, nasty things. They would call my home all the time, and unfortunately, my wife, Mrs. King, would have to answer these calls. She caught the brunt of it because she was home most of the time. I don't know how she was able to deal with it, but she did. But in any case, a call came in, and I answered. And on the other end, it was an ugly voice. And he said, basically, "Nigger, we're tired of your mess now. If you don't leave town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out and blow up your home." I immediately hung up. I had had calls before, but somehow this call really got to me. I went into the bedroom, tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I got up and I looked at my little girl who had been born just over a month ago, and I looked at my devoted and loving wife, and a fear and anxiety gripped me. They could be taken away from me at any time, or I could be taken away from them, and I couldn't stay in the bedroom, so I had to go into the kitchen. And I warmed up some coffee maybe thinking coffee would bring me some kind of relief. And I started thinking about many things. I started thinking about my university days and how we would have debates on the presence of sin and evil in the world. But that was theoretical. That didn't help me. My father and my mother were 150 miles away. I couldn't call on them. I had to call on that somebody that my father talked about in his sermons that could make a way out of no way. And so I sat down, oh yes, I sat down and said a prayer over that cup of coffee. God, I'm down here. I'm trying to do right. I believe what I'm doing is right, but I'm losing my courage. I'm faltering. And I don't want the people who chose me to speak for them to see me faltering, because if they see me faltering, they may falter. I'm at the end of my rope. I really don't know what to do. And Mr. Cook, a voice came from within me, speaking to me as loud as I'm speaking to you. And it said, Martin Luther King Jr., you stand up. You stand up for truth. You stand up for righteousness. You stand up for justice. And lo, I will be with you to the end of the earth. You stand up for truth, and I'll never leave you alone. I'll never leave you alone. I'll never leave you. I'll never leave you alone. And I knew that was Jesus talking to me, telling me to still fight on. And I felt there was a lifting of a burden. And I knew that come what may, I knew that God was with me. Now, 3 days later, I was in Reverend Abernathy's church, and I was sitting in the front, and I saw all this commotion in the back and people wanting to come down but then go back. And finally, I had to ask what was going on, and Reverend Abernathy came to me and said, Martin, your home was bombed. I said, well, is Coretta and Yolanda all right? He said, well, we're trying to find that out now. There was a calm that came over me because of what had happened to me 3 days ago. And I said, well, if this is what God intends for me, I will try to bear it as much as I can. And so I told the people in the church what had happened, and I hurriedly went to my home. And as I was heading home, I saw wave upon wave of black people coming to the house, very angry. Some of them had sticks and bottles. Some of them had guns. And I ran up the stairs, and I saw my wife and my child, and I hugged them. I thanked God that they were there. And then somebody came to the door and said, you know, there may be a riot out here. You need to come out here. And so I came out and said, my wife and child are all right. I'm all right. I want all of you who have weapons, please take them home. This movement is God's movement. And if something should happen to me today or tomorrow, this movement will continue because God knows this movement is right. We must love our white brothers. Not what they do, but we must love our white brothers. This is what we're taught. Please, please, please go home. And then the city fathers came up and started talking, and the people were getting angry again. I said, please let them say what they have to say. God is with us. And I remember someone yelling, God bless you, Reverend King. God bless me. Later that evening, we were staying at a friend's house, and I was sitting up in the bed and looking out the window, seeing the street lamp in the distance, and an old feeling came over me. Anger, bitterness, hatred. What kind of people would bomb someone's house and murder their family? What kind of people are these? Then another voice said, now, Martin, you can hate the deed, and you can work to change the system that would allow this type of thing, but don't hate them. They know not what they do. But you change that system. That's what you focus on. And that, Mr. Cook, is how this movement has impacted my faith. And there's been many times where I've had tension-packed moments, but I always remember January 27th, 1956. Now, I have a sermon to do, but by the way, could you do me a favor? You know that part that I was telling you about my father and the whippings and all of that? Could you please kind of edit that out? You see, my father went to Morehouse too. And if he happened to pick up the Maroon Tiger and he's reading about all of this, well, he may try to help me become somebody again. And I don't want that. So if you could edit that out, that would be fine. Now, I'm going to see you later after the sermon, and we'll talk later on tomorrow on the phone. So till then, Mr. Cook, you take care. Goodbye.
At this time, I'll ask Ms. Rosa Parks to come back to the stage along with Mr. Martin Luther King Jr., and they will take some questions if you have any about them. I'll go ahead and get us started. Would you guys like to both come on back? I think just in terms of thinking about these histories and really how your stories overlap, I would love to know the ways in which you see each other as part of this time period, or the experiences in which your stories do overlap. You seems like you both had a crisis of faith and questions about humanity and things that looks like. So I'll get us started there.
Well, I heard this man speak when he first arrived in Montgomery. And I knew then that he was exceptional and that God had a hand on him. And although I wasn't going to go to his church, I knew that he would be important to all of us in Montgomery. And I was so pleased when he got up to speak for the MIA. I did attend that meeting. I was not a part of not riding the buses that day. I was at court. And of course, I was found guilty. But the response to him was expected because I think there was so much of God's truth in what you said and how you carried yourself. And my role was so small, but I'm a bit of a worker bee. So I went to his house that night. His house was bombed, and helped sweep up the glass and just get everything in order. Whatever he asked, I did. I did a speaking tour during the spring, and that's when I first got my ulcers that plague me even today. But he was a comfort and a good friend, even as I struggled to speak to people in Chicago and San Francisco, New York. We needed what he had in terms of leadership. He's a good friend and has a good sense of humor. I hope you observed that as he spoke tonight.
I'm humbled by Ms. Parks. She was involved in the movement way before I was. And I am deeply humbled by her. I think she, in her humility, she, I guess, lessens her role, but she really was the one who sparked this. And it takes a lot of courage. I don't know if you really understand how much courage it takes to stand up in a system that is set against you. And she had been taking a stand years before what happened on December 1st, 1955. And I think a lot of people may not know that or may not appreciate it. I know I do. She had been working with the NAACP. I remember they had asked me to join it, and I said, well, I couldn't. So there was I guess, a certain hesitation that I had. But Mrs. Parks was in the movement. She was committed, and she represented the people of Montgomery who were committed, and they were tired. And they were the ones who really, I was asked, and I did the best I could. But yeah, but they were really the ones. They were really the ones, the heroes of Montgomery and of that movement, without a doubt.
Yes. And it wasn't until several years after that you shared that story of God speaking to you directly.
Yes.
And I had a similar experience. In fear, I fell on my knees and prayed. And then when I was quiet after begging God to help us through this, a calm came over me. And I felt God's presence. I did not hear God's presence. But it was at the same time that Martin had his epiphany.
Yes.
God works in mysterious ways.
Yes, he does.
But he works for us.
Yes, we wouldn't have been able to have the movement without that. That was the main focus for me. I wouldn't have been able to make it. And that spirit is what kept the people going despite all the turmoil. And you spoke about it. So many things had happened during that time, and there was so much resistance that it was our faith that enabled us to overcome it. Yes.
Other questions? Yes, over there. Just speak loudly.
Okay. During this time, how did you work with the children? I always think of the children of this time to maintain that sort of child innocence, right? To have joy when you're in childhood. Because you talked about
the bridge when you knew that, once your young friend couldn't play with you anymore. Did you ever just talk to children about that, how to see that? I always think about lost childhoods.
You go ahead.
Well, that was certainly part of my work, and it continues. I continue to try to reach young people so that they would have a Christian perspective as he said, to love people even though you hate what they are doing. And that I want children to understand that they are children of God, they are loved, and they have a right to stand up for themselves. And so, through my youth council, Johnny and I made that effort, and it is my hope that now that I'm up in Detroit, that I will have some sort of organization where I can reach out to children and give them the hope that they have power through God's strength to make change happen, which would be a benefit for all of us in this country.
You know, children were the ones who really ignited the Birmingham movement. There were many adults who were fearful of losing jobs, and they had jobs to lose. And so they could only but so much put themselves on the front line. But one of my aides, James Bevel, had said that he was, talking to the young people and telling them what was happening, and the young people were inspired. And so, although I was against it at first, because I didn't want to see any young people in harm's way, the young people were the perfect instrument. And so they came by the thousands in engaging with water hoses and dogs and policemen. But it was young people that really turned that movement around, because the movement was faltering. Even when I had gone to jail, when I and Reverend Abernathy had gone to jail, hopefully to jumpstart the movement, it was the young people. So Mrs. Parks is absolutely correct. They're really the hope. And it wasn't a thing where we were trying to keep them from the harsher aspects, because they were living in those aspects. That was the tragedy of segregation. And they basically took it on. They took it head on. And they changed Birmingham and changed this nation forever. Yeah. So I'm...
And you must remember that the schools they were going to were segregated schools, but they had Negro teachers, and they imparted a lot of strength and wisdom and reasoned with them, to the point that I told you that there were 4 women involved in the case that was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. One of those women was a 15-year-old high school student, Claudette Colvin,
yes.
And the other was an 18-year-old young woman, Louise Smith. So they were a part of it from the beginning, and a part of the success.
Yes.
I'm just curious about the place and time. Was there something special about Montgomery that sparked this? We talked about the MIA as the leading voice in that movement, but obviously this Jim Crow laws were all over the Deep South. Was there something that made Montgomery special, or was it just happenstance and that's where? Yeah.
God moved through her.
And it's God moving. It's not us in particular.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, it had to be God, because there's no other explanation for it.
Yes.
Why? I mean, there were others, as Mrs. Parks said, there were others, that had dealt with the buses, but there was something about her case, and it was something about that time, and it would just, I call it the zeitgeist, you know, the spirit of the times, and that's what happened in Montgomery. And that was God. There's no other explanation for it.
Right.
Yes.
There were several things that happened as well in terms of that same year that provoked us and worried us and frustrated us. Claudette Colvin, that 15-year-old who had refused to give up her seat and was arrested, that was reported. Many things were not reported in our newspaper. So the entire community was aware of it. And they were very angry about the way she was treated.
Yes, that's right.
Because she was such a young girl. And she said publicly, we had just learned about our rights and had studied the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I knew that I had a right to sit on the bus. And that galvanized our community. And then we were all stressed beyond measure about what had happened to Emmett Till.
Emmett Till, yes.
And for some reason, those feelings were community-wide because I told you a little bit about the contention about who was to lead the MIA. You know, the NAACP was failing. It was an organization along with the Progressive Democratic Association, the Citizens Steering Committee, other organizations fighting for our rights. And there was a focus of all three on getting registered to vote. But the other two organizations, not to offend my friend, but the NAACP was failing, and the other two organizations were succeeding because they were the middle class,
Yes.
the professionals. And when E.D. Nixon, who was a Pullman porter,
Yes.
got the presidency of the NAACP, he was a fighter. He does not have the sophisticated way of speaking.
Yeah, you're right.
As
Yes.
well-educated Negroes such as Reverend King.
Yes.
And with that, the membership of the Montgomery branch grew a great deal because there was an influx of working people. And that E.D. Nixon was remarkable in that
Yes, he was.
if he thought there could be a case on police brutality, he went to the police
he did.
commissioner and demanded assertively, not inappropriately, but assertively, that they be held accountable, those police officers. And it was the first time in Montgomery that any police officer was indicted, but he was warned before he could get arrested, and he left Montgomery. But all of these things have been going on during the summer and the early fall before the bus boycott was able to happen. It was the first time that all classes and levels of education of Negroes pulled together for that to work together for one single cause.
E.D. Nixon was really the agent that, because I was hesitant, he had asked me about, having the meeting, and I was hesitant, and I said, well, let me think about it. And he said, well, you don't have any time to think about it because the meeting is going to be held at your church. So E.D. Nixon was a fighter, as she said, and he really believed in pushing, and he knew that this case, with this brave lady here, was the one, and he said so. So yes, there was, as she stated, there was this confluence of the working class and the middle class, and everybody worked together. That's why the boycott was so successful.
Thank you.
but I will open it up to questions for Becky and Marvin about their performance or their character and more about their specific roles. I think there was one.
What do you think that you've taken away from what you've learned that you can potentially use towards now or what's coming? To change, obviously change the situation.
Frederick Douglass said something that what a person, he said what a man, but what a person works on them as well. A person may carve out their circumstances, but their circumstances carve him out, or him or her out as well. Obviously, there's a lot that what Dr. King was talking about and what Rosa Parks had fought for and talked about can be applied to now. There is a tendency for us to freeze our heroes in amber, to pick a moment and say, you know, that's it. With Dr. King, it was the I Have a Dream. With Rosa Parks, it was, you know, her, you know, iconic sitting, you know, on the bus and refusing to move. But they did so much more than that. They evolved in many ways, and they were complex, and they were still engaging with, you know, the injustices of the South, of the country. And so I think if people would look at their entire life and their engagement, I think a lot could be gleaned from that could be applied to what we're dealing with now.
Yes, I would agree with that, for sure. I was so impressed that Rosa Parks was a seamstress. She picked cotton when she was a child. She did house cleaning and that kind of thing. She was ordinary. And I am convinced, that God will pull you out. You know, it's not that King was seeking. You know, God just like put it right out there and said, you do it, you do it. And I think that's what it was for Rosa Parks. And I think I can't claim to know a whole lot of scripture, but I think when you look at scripture, God would pick people to do the work, and they would go, me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to run away to Nineveh. Oops, I'm in a fish.
Yeah.
And the fish is taking me to Nineveh. Or Sarah, you're going to have a child who will, you know, and Sarah's, me? I'm 80 or 90 years old.
Yeah.
God, you've got to be kidding. It's like he picks ordinary people, puts them in situations. You had a quote similar to that. And because he has chosen you to do extraordinary things. And I don't think it's a matter of a kid growing up thinking, I'm destined to change the world. It's just like, I'm going to live my life. I'm going to try to do the best I can. And then bingo, they're in a situation where, for whatever reason, Rosa wasn't thinking of consequences. All she knew was that she could not do it again. An ordinary woman who was treated the way all black people were treated in the Jim Crow South. And she just did one little action. But, you know, as a Christian, I say God used it.
Yes.
And so, but that's what I took from it and continue to take from all the characters that I do, that ordinary people, that's you and me, we do extraordinary things. And that, well, I had another point that just escaped my mind, but that's what impressed me about Harriet Tubman and Maya Angelou. You study their life stories.
Yes.
And they are a result of their circumstances.
Yep.
But, you know, they're pretty much everyday people.
You know, there's a great documentary on King called Citizen King, if you ever get a chance to see it. And they're talking about him, and one of his folks he worked with, Victoria Gray, she said, people who are called, they can say yay or nay. You know, they can, negotiate it that way. But people who are chosen, they can't negotiate it. It's you. And, whatever comes with that, you deal with it. And that, again, those ordinary people who are placed in these extraordinary situations, and they're able to rise somehow to the challenge.
And you might say that King was exceptional, but there were other blacks who were just as well educated.
Yeah. Yep.
And there was a large middle class in Atlanta and in Montgomery.
Yeah.
And this gentleman's very patient, holding his hand up. If that's enough of an answer.
The day that was killed, his last words were, "I have a dream."
Well, I've been to the mountaintop.
And the other thing is, both Rose and Marvin, there was a moment where they said, "I'm called, I'm chosen, whatever." And that's very powerful. What do you have to say about it?
Well, I guess what we've been saying, but his last words were, I've been to the mountaintop. Yeah, those were his, I guess that's the speech that I called the mountaintop speech. I tend to think that, King is known for the I Have a Dream speech. And that's, I guess, his most famous speech. But Dr. King said a whole lot of things. As a matter of fact, the second part of my presentation is Dr. King doing his Why I Oppose the Vietnam War sermon. And in that, they say was not as well known, but there are those who say that that was his most courageous speech, because he gave that speech in the face of all kinds of opposition, even those who worked with him. But Dr. King was a man of conscience. And as he would say, I'm a preacher. I'm not a civil rights leader. I'm not a politician. I'm a preacher, and I'm here to preach the good news. So he truly believed in that. That was what got him through all of these difficulties. Because, he was not a perfect man, but he was a great man. Well, there are no perfect people. But he was a great man and what he constantly leaned on was his faith. That's how he was able to go as far as he did. So I think we have to look at his life and look at Rosa Parks' life and all the other folks who we admire, look at their life in totality. We could look at the moment where they're lifted up, but I think it's also powerful to see the moment when they're down on the ground, and what do they do then? I think that's the moment. That's where really we really see what kind of individual these folks are. So that would be my answer. I don't know if it's a good one or not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, folks.